For 7 years, my husband called my company the little candle thing. He said it at parties, with a laugh, the way you'd mention a hobby. She makes candles, he'd tell people, before steering the conversation back to his real career. And for 7 years, I let him. I let everyone in our lives believe it was a cute little project that kept me busy at the kitchen table. What none of them knew, what Brian especially didn't know, was that the year before, the little candle thing had quietly started earning 3 times his salary. And what Brian didn't know, as I sat in my car outside his office at 9 o'clock that night, was that the man who was so sure he was carrying our family had been cheating on me for the better part of a year. He had no idea about either number. Not how much I really made, not how much I already knew. This is the story of the day I finally let him discover, both calmly, completely, and far too late to do a single thing about it. Before I go further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has anyone ever called your work just a little thing? A hobby? A side project? Something cute? And when they did you correct them? Or did you let them underestimate you? Be honest. Because I let mine do it for years. And I'm about to tell you exactly why that turned out to be the smartest thing I ever did. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Here's the part Brian chose to forget. I didn't start with much. I started at our kitchen table, pouring candles into jars at night after my day job. Because I loved it, and because we needed the extra money. Brian had the real income then, a good corporate salary, a title he liked saying out loud. So when my little hobby started making a bit of money, he thought it was sweet. Look at you, he'd say, playing shop. And here is the thing about that first sign. Because in this story, the signs were never loud. They were small. The first one wasn't a lipstick stain or a hotel bill. It was a sentence at dinner. I had just told him, carefully, that I'd landed my first wholesale account. A real store wanted to carry my candles. It was the proudest moment of my working life. And Brian looked up from his phone, smiled, and said, "That's cute. Just don't let your little hobby get in the way of real life." Then he went back to his phone. I remember the cold feeling that settled in my chest. Not anger, something quieter. Because in that moment I understood that no matter how big it got, he was always going to call it small. And this is the part I'm not proud of. And the part that saved me. Instead of arguing, I made a decision. I stopped telling him the numbers. I let him keep believing it was a hobby. I let him keep being the real earner in his own mind. And quietly, on my own, I started building something he wasn't watching. Over the next few years, the little candle thing grew. The one store became a dozen. The dozen became an online brand. I hired help. I moved it out of the kitchen and into a small studio. And the money became serious. But every time it grew, Brian's comments stayed exactly the same size. "How's the candle thing? Still playing shop?" At his work dinners, he'd introduce me as my wife. She does crafts. And every time, I just smiled and said it was going fine. Because by then, I had learned something valuable. A man who underestimates you will never see you coming. What I didn't realize until much later was that his comments weren't just arrogance. They were cover. Because while Brian was busy telling the world that he was the provider and I had a hobby, the truth underneath had quietly flipped. My hobby was now paying for most of our life. His salary, it turned out, hadn't grown in years. And a man whose pride depends on being the breadwinner does not handle quietly becoming the opposite very well. The signs started small there, too. A guy's weekend he'd never taken before. His phone, which used to lie face up on the counter, now lived face down in his pocket. A new gym routine, new clothes, a sudden interest in how he looked. Little things. The tip of something I couldn't see yet. I told myself I was imagining it. Until the night I wasn't. I'd driven to his office to surprise him. He'd said he was working late again. His car was in the lot. So was another car I recognized, because it belonged to Lauren, a younger woman from his department he'd mentioned a few times. Always a little too casually. I sat there for a long time. And eventually they came out together, and the way he touched her back as they walked to her car told me everything the late nights had been about. I want to tell you I felt rage. I didn't. What I felt was that same cold quiet from years ago. Just deeper now, the clarity that comes a half second before the pain. And then I did the single most important thing I did in this entire story. Nothing. I didn't get out. I drove home, I poured myself a glass of water, and when Brian came in an hour later, tired from work, I asked how his night was. He said long, exhausting. I said, "You work so hard." And I meant it as the first move in something he wouldn't understand for months. Because I had just realized, the second he knew that I knew, I'd lose every advantage I had. And I had spent years quietly building advantages he couldn't even see. So I started a folder. Not a metaphor, an actual one. And over the next weeks, I learned the truth of my own marriage in order. Like a stranger reading someone else's file. And what I found under the surface was so much bigger than an affair. If you've ever been underestimated by the one person who was supposed to believe in you, most do me one quick favor. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, slow burn revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who's being told right now that her dream is just a little thing. And believe me, what was under the surface of my marriage is the part that changes everything. The affair had been going on for nearly a year. But that wasn't the part that took my breath. The part that did was how Brian had been describing his own life to Lauren. Because in their messages, Brian wasn't a man whose wife out-earned him 3-1. In Brian's version, he was the successful one. The provider. He told Lauren about his beautiful house, his lifestyle, the vacations he worked so hard to pay for. He called me, more than once, the wife who does a little candle hobby. He had taken the life my business built, the house, the cars, the comfort, and presented all of it to another woman as proof of his own success. He had been living on the thing he mocked, while mocking it to the woman he was leaving me for. And then I found the plan. Brian was preparing to divorce me, and his entire strategy rested on a belief I had spent 7 years carefully feeding him. He believed he was the breadwinner. He believed my business was a small hobby. So he believed that in a divorce he was entitled to half of his assets, and that I would walk away with my little candles and not much else. He had no idea that the company he called a hobby was by then worth more than everything else we owned combined, or that I had built it, structured it, and banked it in ways that made it unmistakably mine. He had spent years making me small in his mind. And in doing that, he had completely lost track of how big I'd actually become. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to correct him. I was going to let him keep believing every single thing he'd told himself right up until the moment it could no longer help him. The next morning, I went to see 2 people. First, a lawyer. And she told me 3 things I haven't forgotten. The first, because I had built the business myself, structured it carefully, and kept its finances clean and separate. My position was extraordinarily strong, far stronger than Brian, in his fantasy of being the provider, could possibly imagine. The second, I was by a wide margin, the financially dominant partner, fully documented. The man who thought he held the high ground was standing in a hole he dug with his own pride. And the third thing she said, quietly, most people in your position can't wait to tell their spouse how wrong they are. Don't. Let him keep believing he's the big earner. The longer he believes it, the worse his position gets and the calmer your exit will be. The second person I went to see was my own accountant, and together we made sure every thread of the business was locked down, protected, and clearly mine. I quietly separated what needed separating. I documented everything: the affair, the messages, the finances, the years of him living on income he pretended didn't exist. The folder grew thick. And every evening I came home and asked Brian about his hard day at his real job, and told him not to work too hard. But a few weeks in, he got impatient and he started to move. He told me, over dinner, that he'd been thinking, and that maybe we'd grown apart, and that we should talk about the future. He was setting the stage to file. He'd even, I could tell, started mentally spending the half he was sure he'd get. He had no idea he was about to ask a judge to split a company he didn't understand the size of in a marriage where the numbers were the exact opposite of what he'd been bragging about. And here's the small, almost sad twist I found near the end. In their last messages, Lauren was asking Brian about their future, the house, the lifestyle, the success she thought she was marrying into. And Brian kept promising her all of it, confidently, as if it were his to promise. She had fallen for a provider who didn't exist. She was about to leave her own life for a man whose entire shine came from a little candle hobby he didn't even respect. We had both, in our own ways, been sold the same lie. So I let it all run. I let Brian file for divorce, full of confidence. And at the mediation, the calm, fluorescent lit room where the numbers finally come out on paper, I watched it happen. I watched my husband's lawyer present him as the provider seeking his fair share. And then I watched my lawyer very calmly lay the actual financials on the table. The real revenue of the little candle thing. The years of figures. The plain black and white proof that the hobby he'd mocked at every dinner party out earned his salary 3-to-1, and had been quietly paying for the life he'd been showing off to another woman. I will never forget Brian's face as he read those numbers. It was the same face, in reverse, as the one he used to make when he said, "playing shop." All the color, all the certainty, draining out of it at once, from the bottom up. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't have a small word for what I'd built. He didn't have any words at all. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so because I never had told him, and that was the whole point. I just let the numbers say, calmly and completely, what I'd spent years choosing not to. The divorce was clean, because the truth was undeniable on paper. He left with what was actually his, which wasn't much. I kept my company, my home, and my peace. And Lauren, I heard, did not stay long once the provider she'd been promised turned out to be a man who'd been living on his wife's candles. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who won, but as someone who was made to feel small for years by the person who should have been proudest of her, it's this. When someone underestimates you, you don't always have to correct them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep building, quietly, and let your work speak when the moment comes. Never shrink yourself to fit someone else's idea of who you are. The people who truly love you will celebrate how big you become. Only the ones who need you small will ever call it just a little thing. There's one more thing, though. About 6 months later, I got an email from a woman I'd never met, who had just started dating Brian, asking me, carefully, whether the things he'd told her about his successful career were true. What I told her and what the two of us decided to do next is a story entirely its own, and it might be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You're going to want to see how that one ends.